What's up, guys? Simone Fan 101 here, and I am now recording my number 5 of my top 10 favorite video game series list, or best video game series list, in my opinion. So, yeah, that's gonna be how it is. Actually, I saw this format before, so I'm gonna pull up the music from said video game series. My number 5 video game series is a game series that again, is another one I've loved ever since I was a kid. Um, and it's something that I've always, been akin to, loving this, and not just the main series, but the spin-offs, everything I really like about it. Um, and you'll see from the music, from the video. If you recognize the theme, this is actually, well, a little bit different, but whatever. Give it a second. For those of you guys who recognize this, my number 5 favorite video game series of all time is Final Fantasy. I have loved Final Fantasy since I was a young lad. In fact, I just found a picture of one of my older brothers. I was only 2 years old. I was about 2 years old, maybe 1.5 in the picture. And it's me sitting there watching one of my older brothers play Final Fantasy 2. Or, well, Final Fantasy 4, but, it was called Final Fantasy 2 on the Super Nintendo when it was released here in America. And I was sitting there and I was watching him play it. Which really weird when you think about it, because I don't even remember it. Now, Final Fantasy series. This is a series that I've known since I was a kid. I think the very first game I do remember, like actually remember, was Final Fantasy 2. It was Final Fantasy 2, aka what is really Final Fantasy 4 on Super Nintendo. I remember playing a game. I was instantly hooked. When I was a kid especially. I loved the Dark Knight version of Cecil because Cecil Harvey was the main character. He looked like such a complete badass, and even today, I'm still a fan of whoever looks badass. Batman, Heath Ledger's Joker, The Undertaker, in this case, Dark Knight, Cecil Harvey. He looks like a complete fucking badass. That's why I kind of like Kane in the same game. Character in the same game. He looked like a badass, and he was a dragoon knight. And that was part of why I liked it when I was a kid. I didn't get defeated when I was a kid until 2 years later. Because remember, Final Fantasy 4 was regarded as one of the hardest games in the Final Fantasy genre, in the Final Fantasy series. And I pretty much mastered the game. So thinking that I've mastered the game, and it's such a freaking difficult game, I find a little bit of pride in myself. The next game I remember playing is, of course, a game that a lot of people consider to be the best. Final Fantasy 3, aka Final Fantasy 6 for the Super Nintendo. Again, another one that was released in Japan. It was released in Japan, but called by a different name later here in the States. What I liked about Final Fantasy 3 or Final Fantasy 6 was the graphics. The graphics were very good. The music, and you're listening to some of the music right now. The music is fucking kick ass. I mean, who doesn't like this music? If you're a gamer, you should like this music. Final Fantasy 4 and 6. Both of them gave us great characters. Final Fantasy 4 gave us, the aforementioned Kane and Cecil. Another badass in terms of the villain was Galvez. Rydia, who's your summoner, she summons giant monsters to kick ass. Guys like like Yang, who used a freaking flaws and shit. You kick your ass barehanded, other than maybe flaws. Palom Forum, you know, you had your mages throughout the game. Palom Forum, Pella, Fusoya, who's like a freaking moon person, basically. Um, you had kick-ass characters, like physical characters, like Yang. You had Sid, and then you had a couple, you know, goofball characters, but also fun ones. Again, Palom Forum, Edge, who is basically, who, by the way, it's not a name on Edge like from WWE. No, there's a different Edge. He was like a ninja who tended to hit on, you know, Rydia, which was hilarious. So many gameplay, um, you know, stuff in that. I have no idea what I'm saying. But Final Fantasy VI, again, didn't beat it till years later, but it had great things like Kefka. It had Locke, who I think you have a thing for Terra. Terra being like a freaking alien type person herself. Only like one character died in the whole game, and when a Final Fantasy character dies in a game, you tend to feel for that. I'll get to Aerith in a second. But you know, Final Fantasy VI, another game I grew up on. Again, I didn't get too far in it. I got as far as I think it was like the train boss, and then after that, I just didn't care anymore to keep playing. But the music was great. Music was even better, in my opinion, the next game. And you all know this game, Final Fantasy VII. You've heard of it by now. Hell, my brother has it. My older brother has it. It's a fucking awesome game, and I played through it several times. I've beaten it several times, and it never gets old because there's so many different things or different ways you can go about it. You know, Final Fantasy VII. That was a game that is one of the highest selling Final Fantasy games. No, not even Final Fantasy. One of the highest selling RPG games ever made. It's sold so high here in the U.S. Which is weird because Bernie Stolar, who was the leader of Sega, basically, he said that RPGs would not work here in the States. RPGs don't sell. Go fuck yourself in the ass, Bernie. But anyways, back to Final Fantasy. This game was, man, this game was very revolutionary. It popularized the RPGs in America. RPGs were a lot of fun before, but this game was like, okay, now RPGs are a thing in the States. And it gave rise to a couple spin-offs. It gave, especially Final Fantasy. The Final Fantasy games have had a couple spin-offs, and the one thing that's special about Final Fantasy is that Final Fantasy, even though there's a lot of titles in the games, there's like up to like 15 or something. There's no real sequels to the games if you just try to go by 1, by 2, and by 3. Instead, it's basically a different. It's basically like a different series for each game. It's like a completely different game with new characters. Man, just things to describe it. Wow, like you have a couple similarities. You got your chocobos, which is basically riding chickens, which is hilarious. You have a character by the name of Sid, who's in pretty much every game. You have your Star Wars references, which it has a character named Biggs and Wedge, which was in Final Fantasy VI. They called him Vix and Wedge, dumbasses. But still, you know, game series, a lot of fun. And it popularized Final Fantasy here in the States. And the thing is, when they were going from one to each game, several games didn't make it here in the U.S. at the time that it was made. Final Fantasies 2, 3, and 5 were not released here in the United States. Final Fantasies 1, 4, and 6 were, and they called 4 and 6 the Final Fantasies 2 and 3. So yeah, there is that. A little bit of confusion there. So when Final Fantasy VII came out, it also came out with the rise of the internet. So then they re-released several of the games over time. Final Fantasy III was re-released on DS years after the original re-releases. Final Fantasy II was released on several occasions. Um, you know, they got a lot of Game Boy ports, Game Boy Advance, I mean. Um, and just a lot of games. Like some of them I'll go into. Uh, like for instance, Final Fantasy Tactics was possibly one of the best Final Fantasy games. Um, which is weird because it's not even a Final Fantasy game with the main series. It's a side series. Basically, a kid gets pulled into another world of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy in his world is a game, but he gets pulled into it. Um, and uh, he freaking becomes like a fighter, and it just goes on from there. They made two other versions of the game. There was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, which is a game I'm the most familiar with in terms of the Tactics series, because I played that game for shit, and I beat it several times. And the games, Tactics may be fun, but it's also hard, so you might get your ass kicked a lot. But Tactics Advanced 2, which was Grimoire of the Rift or something like that, was released on DS. Like the first one, very little mention of the. It was like it was a sequel, but with like completely new characters, which is hilarious. You had you had several other games. You had prequels and sequels for several of the games. Final Fantasy IV got a sequel called Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, which was released on the Wii. You had Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy VII. Oh god, that is a series all on its own. You had the Final Fantasy. There was the prequel game which released on PSP called Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. A great game, I might add. You get to play as Zack Fair. Another game which I consider one of the best. Final Fantasy VII. There was like a mobile game which you played as one of the agents, basically. I forget what their names are. The Turks, that's what they are. I call them agents, like from the Matrix. So there's that. You had Final Fantasy VII. It was the game with Vincent. What was that called? You get to play as Vincent, who was actually somewhat of an optional character, but mainly becomes canon. In the main series, and his history is interesting. It was called the Dirge of Cerberus. That's what it was called, Dirge of Cerberus. I don't know where the hell I go for a second. You even had a movie. You had two movies that were based in the Final Fantasy universe. One of them was a movie based off of the popular Final Fantasy VII game. Another one was based before that. It was made before that, and it was, again, much like the games, was in its own little universe. It had its own new set of characters and plot. A lot of people shat on the movie because it had nothing. A lot of people said because it had nothing to do with the games, which the whole point of Final Fantasy is that everything is different from each other. So fuck you on that one. And they made Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, which wasn't as good as a movie, but it is entertaining. So if you want just an entertaining movie, you can watch Advent Children. Or Advent Children Complete, as it's got a couple extra scenes and a little bit more Zack Fair, because he wasn't a fully developed character until Crisis Core, and then they revamped the movie a little bit, adding a little bit more Zack into it. Which is nice, because Zack Fair is a favorite character. And other games, like there was a Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy 9. Was it 9 or 11? No, it was Final Fantasy 11. I think that was like a more like an MMORPG almost. That was an online game, so there wasn't really any. You would say not really any like story or plot. There were plots into it, but not too much. Final Fantasy 12, I remember playing on PS2. That game I had a lot. I think that was the last Final Fantasy game which really, tried to be its own series, because Final Fantasy games like Final Fantasy 13 and 14, And yes, this is all Final Fantasy music, by the way. Games like Final Fantasy 13, 14, I think they made a 15, although I haven't really followed it. It hasn't really impressed me. They're fine, but they're just not as good as the earlier games. Especially games like Final Fantasy 9, Final Fantasy 7 or 4, or Final Fantasy, the first Final Fantasy or whatever. Of course, there's been other spin-offs. There was a couple games that were called Final Fantasy, but were not really Final Fantasy, or on the Game Boy games. They were based off another legend, like the Secret of Mana. Remember Secret of Mana? Well, they made a lot of games in here in the U.S. that was called Sword of Mana, Sword of Mana, something of Mana, and Final Fantasy. One of the Final Fantasy Game Boy games was made later on Sword of Mana, and there were two other Final Fantasy games which were part of another series that it's not really that related to Final Fantasy. But yeah, Final Fantasy series, they had a lot going for them. They're still going strong. SquareSoft, Square Enix, whatever you want to call it. They made a masterpiece. If I had to choose my favorite Final Fantasy game, for instance, it's a tough one because there's a lot of great ones. This soundtrack, you're listening to is from Final Crisis Core. But if I had to choose my favorite, it would probably have to be Final Fantasy IV. A part of that is because I grew up on the game. It was the first game I ever really played for RPGs, so there was that. So that's why I loved it so much. I got into all the characters. I got into their motivations. I loved the story. It's difficult, yet for me at this point in my life, it's not hair-pullingly difficult. It's just really hard at times, especially when you're fighting the Dark Elf. Oh god, that fucking sucks. You had a lot of really great shit that was on Final Fantasy IV. I prefer the Final Fantasy IV Game Boy Advance version, not so much for like the graphics or anything, but because you had the New Game Plus, which is a thing that Final Fantasy is slowly and surely becoming known for. I think really more so in the ports, the Game Boy Advance and the DS and the PSP. So now that makes it a lot of fun. But you had of course the characters. There are several characters. You have your Moogle, you have your Chocobo, but there's two characters that really got popular out of the series: Cloud Strife and Sephiroth. Cloud and Sephiroth were two of the most popular characters in Final Fantasy, in the Final Fantasy universe, which is why those characters, along with characters from other Final Fantasy games, have crossed universes. I mean, two real game series. One was another side series I almost forgot to mention. The Dissidia Final Fantasy, which is a fighting game that and there was the Dissidia Final Fantasy 012, which is basically a remake / extended version of the game, which is basically what it is. Added a few more characters from Final Fantasy 13, added Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy 5, it added Kain from Final Fantasy 4, which made me very happy because I'm a personal fan of Kain Highwind. It added Tifa from Final Fantasy 7. You had Garland, I think is his name. Not Garland, but one of the main villains from Final Fantasy 12, the guy who's under the helmet, the guy who kind of looks like Garland. I forget his name, but but he was in the game. It was just a lot of fun to play as. I think Vaughn was in the game as like a special edition character in the extended version, not so much the original. I think only the villain from Final Fantasy 12 was in the extended version. But just a great series. It was just so awesome. And it's just Kefka you're listening to. You're not going to listen to the whole thing, but again, favorite game is Final Fantasy 4. And so many great things about it. The graphics were always very good. The music, just listen to this. It's a fucking orchestra. and it was awesome. One Winged Angel is probably the most famous track. Maybe not the best, but the most famous. Um, but music, characters, gameplay, it revolutionized the RPG genre. So all those combined, I have to choose this game. If there's any stinkers I wanted you to stay away from, there's not really so much in the way of like shitty games, but there are disappointing games. Uh, some people might be disappointed by Final Fantasy VIII because it's not as good as Final Fantasy VII, but it's still a great game, so play it. Final Fantasy X, some people do have a problem with because of the main character, Titus, or Titus as some people call him. His name is pronounced Titus. There's City of Games I played, and, get used to the controls and how it works, and you'll have a lot of fun playing it. Um, it's just a fighting game, just with different styles. Um, I guess if you wanted to really ask me which games to stay away from the sequels to Final Fantasy 13, 14. I don't think there was one 14. I think there was only 13. Because I know there was 13 too, and I don't give two fucks about that game. So with that said, guys, that was my number 5 on my top 10 best video game series of all time. Tune in next time, and you will see my number 4. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear about number 4 because even if you're not the biggest Nintendo fan, you've played one of these games. So until next time, guys, see you later. Have a good night, or day, whatever, and peace.